Positioning things exactly where you want them is often a challenge in web design. I'm going to talk about different kinds of positioning that open up some design possibilities. First, let's talk about relative positioning. Relative positioning is a way of positioning an element relative to where it would be if you just left it alone. In other words, it's often used to offset or nudge an element relative to where it wants to be naturally. Let's look at this example. The letter B isn't styled at all, so it's still in its natural static position. And static positioning is basically what you get in HTML unless you use CSS to specify some other positioning method. I use span tags to style the letter O. Specifically, that letter is styled with position relative and top -10 pixels. The position relative descriptor tells the browser that I'm going to position the element relative to where it wants to be naturally. The top -10 pixels means move this element up 10 pixels, and that's why the letter O is a little higher. The next letter that's positioned is the letter N. This time I use top 10 pixels, a positive number, to push the element down 10 pixels from its natural position. Next, we'll talk about fixed positioning, which in many ways is the direct opposite of relative positioning. With fixed positioning, you're taking the element out of the text flow altogether and sticking it right onto the viewport like a post-it note. In this example, each div is a light blue box and each is positioned in a corner of the viewport. Those positions have nothing to do with the page. They would be right where they are now, no matter how short or tall the page is. And that's because fixed positioning is all about the viewport. It doesn't know or care about page content. Another type of positioning, which is a hybrid of relative and fixed position, is called sticky positioning. With sticky position, the element is treated as relatively positioned until it crosses a specific threshold, at which point it is treated as fixed position. In this example, these letter divs are positioned sticky with top 0. So when they reach the top of the viewport, they act like they're fixed position. And when they're not at the top of the viewport, they act like they're relatively positioned. The final type of positioning we'll talk about is absolute positioning. Absolute positioning is not quite like any other kind of positioning. An absolutely positioned element is positioned relative to the nearest containing element that isn't statically positioned. Or if there's no such containing element, then it's positioned relative to the viewport. Here's an example. The div with the green dash border is just a normal, statically positioned element. Contained within that div are 4 other divs. Each of those other divs is absolutely positioned to a corner. And this is a little bit confusing at first, because even though the blue boxes are inside the container div in the code, they're outside that div in the browser. And that's because they're absolutely positioned relative to the nearest non-statically positioned container element. And our container div is statically positioned, so it doesn't count. And when there's no non-statically positioned container div to latch onto, an absolutely positioned element latches onto the viewport instead. So let's suppose that we made the div relatively positioned. Now the little blue boxes are inside the container div because changing it to be relatively positioned means that the absolute positioning of the little divs refers to the corners of that container element and not the viewport. In real life, you would probably always use absolute positioning to position an element inside some other element rather than the viewport because we have fixed position for that. Absolute and fixed position elements have something else in common with each other. They both create elements that are outside the text flow, and that means they can be used to stack, which opens up a lot of web design possibilities. That's it for CSS positioning. Thank you for watching.